they are quite pushy. So it's a responsibility of the parent to understand that you allow the child to enjoy the sport for as long as possible and make sure that you don't put too much pressure on them to be like Littler too soon. He is the exception to the rule.
Hello, welcome along to the latest edition of the Tungsten Talk here at the MODUS Super Series, where today we're going to delve away from the lives of darts players and see how darts players make a livelihood. It's fair to say that since the arrival on the scene of Luke Littler following the 2024 World Darts Championship, there's been a real boom in young players and young people looking to take up the sport of darts. Well, it's fair to say that when you look at systems like the JDC et al., that there's more young talents coming through than ever before. But it wasn't always that way. The asset, Paul Nicholson, is with me in the studio. Now, for you, I can imagine that what was in place when you were younger is a complete and utter world away from what's on offer now.
Yes, because let's face facts, it was a pub game. And in order to grace certain establishments at a young age, when it was the 80s and 90s, it wasn't allowed. So you had to wait until you were 18. Now, if there was a youth system in place in your area, you could take advantage of that. Certain counties throughout England, Scotland, Wales, and maybe different provinces into continental Europe or maybe Oceania or North America, maybe they existed to allow their young stars to thrive. I mean, let's face it, the boys' World Masters, the girls' World Masters, it's been going for quite a long time. But the thing is, not everybody had the privilege of being able to play at such a young age. So a lot of us, we had to wait until we were 18 and legally allowed to grace said establishments.
Which is possibly why we look back years ago, a lot of players didn't begin to develop until their mid-20s or maybe even going into their 30s.
People who thrived in their late teens, early 20s 40 years ago were people who pretty much got off to a very fast start. But if you look at the big names from the late 70s, early 80s, and even in towards the early 90s, they were very, very old compared to the stars that we have coming through at the start of their careers now. Phil Taylor has said already about Luke Littler, he's under the age of 20 winning his first world title. Phil was 30. So a 10-year gap, that can't be ignored. And it's because things have changed before they actually grace a world championship.
Because, yes, we speak about the power of Luke Littler, but you go back only 20 years ago when Adrian Lewis came onto the scene. He was 21, and he was seen as this absolute revelation sensation. No one ever probably seen, maybe with the exception of Eric Bristow, somebody that young that was that good.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, there have been talents, don't get me wrong, but I remember playing in exhibitions in the late 90s as a pub player thinking, I'm looking around, I'm not seeing many young people. It was people who were playing as a hobby. And the established people who went to tournaments, there weren't that many people because they didn't have the money. I remember speaking to Gary Robson about this in the late 90s, and he just said counties like Hampshire, Lancashire, and places in Wales, they had places for people to thrive as youngsters. But there wasn't in Northumberland a place for us to go when we were 12 to 16 years of age or even 17. So now we look at how people come through. And that's why a lot of the stars now are a lot younger. It's been going for about 10 years. I'm sure we'll get onto that in due course. But in times gone by, you look at the early noughties and you look at the 90s and past that, young players were 21 and above. And if you got a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, they were really young.
Which is interesting when you look at the landscape now and we'll compare it to what it was like 20 years ago. You look at the top 16, you look at the top 32, it's littered with players that are at development tour age, for the sake of argument, 24 and under, where maybe even 10 years ago that wasn't even the case.
Yeah, I think 10 years things changed. I think we started to get a little bit of traction with the Junior Darts Corporation. I think at the time, there were a lot of people thinking, is this going to work? Is this going to be something that kids will cling to? Because essentially the JDC was competing with football It was competing with other things that kids would do post-school. So it's not something you would compete with when they're at school. This is an after-school activity. So if you weren't part of a darting family, how did people actually get into this? You look at the record books and how young stars got into darts in previous decades. It's because they were part of darting families. Now, Adrian Lewis was part of a darting family. His dad played on TV. Say no more. You want to follow in their footsteps. But now we have more kids saying, Mum, Dad, can you buy me a dartboard? When they've never seen a dartboard in their life.
And I suppose as well that there was a time where there was preconceptions about the sport, and it's taken a lot of time for darts to get away from those perceived conceptions that were there in the past. Do you think it's only been in the last few years as the sport's really materialized its way into the 21st century that people have thought, actually, this is a bit more viable, that maybe years ago parents looked at darts as that game that was played in the 80s where the image of the sport was completely different?
Well, this is a whole different discussion, but I don't mind talking about this because you talk to someone on the street and you ask them to name a dart player. These days, it's very different. Mm-hmm. So 5 years ago, they would have said Phil Taylor, possibly Michael van Gerwen or Peter Wright, with all due respect to all of the other world champions that we've seen in the last 20 years. But that's who they would have mentioned. Nowadays, I bump into people and they ask me what I do for a living, and the first thing they say is, that Luke Littler's pretty good, isn't he? It's just the way it is. But the perception of this sport for nearly half a century has been because of a famous sketch on Not the 9 O'Clock News in the 80s. It did ruin the reputation of the sport, but if we can be fair to that sketch, it was fairly accurate. Now, I'm not saying that we've got everything right to this point in 2025, but boy, have we done everything we can to repair the reputation of the sport and start to take it forward. I think by the time we get to 2030, 2035, we're going to be very close to where we want to be.
And I suppose one of the steps was adding in, as you mentioned, youth majors. I know the Youth World Masters has gone for a number of years, but then the PDC a number of years later decided to add the development tour. Admittedly, this is for older players that are at the youth range, but they added the development tour, then known as the youth tour. And then they introduced what was then the under 21 World Championship, which was run by Aaron. Was that the first real big steps that we saw about that sport, the sport really progressing from that sense?
Money talks, doesn't it? You talk about that first World Youth Championship played at Alexandra Palace, let's not forget. Aaron Monk did win it, beating Michael van Gerwen in the final, and it was £10,000 for the winner. That was a lot of money for someone to win that kind of prize. And I think off the back of that and James Hubbard winning it the following year, I think James winning it at the O2 in front of 10,000 people was a bigger thing than Aaron winning it at the Palace. Because now we've got two prospective stars, and Van Gerwen would go on to win the World Grand Prix in the PDC system 6 months after that World Youth Final. But playing in front of that many people, I saw so many young stars saying, I want to do that. I want to be part of this. But the one person, and I'm not going to give him all the credit at this point, but he deserves probably 80% of it, and that's Rod Harrington. He said, he was part of the PDC board, we've got to change something. Because if we're constantly getting players from counties in England, parts of Scotland, parts of Wales, maybe the Netherlands, the odd German, the odd other player, is this really good for the development of the sport globally and at the right age for grassroots? He said no. And I think the PDC board agreed. And then we've got the JDC coming in partnership with the PDC. And we're saying, let's not just look after the players from 16 up to the age of 21 or 23 or 25. But let's look earlier than that. Let's get academies. Let's go global with this. Rod Harrington started a lot of these conversations. He's retired from the sport now, but I refuse to make sure that people don't give him the credit he deserves for what he's done.
We'll talk a little bit more about the JDC in the second part of the program, but in terms of the PDC development tour and what it's done for players to bridge that gap between youth darts, developmental darts, and then to the top level, do you think we would have seen such a broad church in terms of winners, in terms of players that have been ready to win events like they have done over the last few years, if it wasn't for a system like that?
Not to this degree. We might have seen some of the stars still come through, like Benito van der Pas in 2016. He won 3 PDC titles that year off the back of being a young player. So we may have seen talents come from the Netherlands and Belgium, but maybe not to the degree that we see now. We are seeing people develop, and that is a very strong word when it comes to this level of darts. But I think the PDC have somewhat migrated from an early model to what we've got now, where people in the top 64 can't grace the development tour, which is a fabulous move. But I think for a while, there needed to be this somewhat controversial angle of having tour card holders on the development tour, so everybody can see when they go to a development tour event that you can be Gian van Veen, you can be Wessel Nijman, you can be Dimitri van den Berg, Luke Humphries. There are so many examples, but now we're talking about development being quicker. Get yourself a win or a lot of money on that tour and progress to where you want to be.
Would we have seen the likes of Luke Humphries possibly go on and do what he did, the likes of Dimitri van den Berg do what he did without the development tour? I'm not saying they're not quality players, because they are quality players, but did that tour home in the skills that they needed to become bona fide winners?
It's easy for me to sit here and say no, because I remember watching a semi-final of a very early World Youth Championship between Dimitri and Humphries, and at that point I'm thinking those two are going to have a rivalry for years. But if they didn't have that semi-final match and they didn't have the experience of using the development tour to its full degree, I'm not sure they'd have the development to this age. They might have garnered it from something else, maybe the amateur dart circuit or something like that, but I think we sit here with so many examples of people who've used the development tour as a stepping stone to greatness. I think Luke Littler would have done it anyway. I think he was only on the development tour for a year, so his progression was fast. But when in the case of Dimitri, in the case of even Martin Schindler, German #1 now, Humphries, Mike De Decker is a great example of this. He was seen as a good player, and when he was on tour, he was still on the development tour, but doing good stuff to keep his confidence up. Gian van Veen has come through dartitis and used that tour to get better. And Wessel Nijman has used it as a route to get back to where he wants to be. There are many more examples of this under the age of 25, and it's played a vital role to give us the players that we need moving forward.
And it feels like that is now the route, isn't it? Development tour, do well there, then you move on to the main tour, and then the success you hope will build from that point onwards.
Yeah, I think because of the questions that we get from parents now, it's where do I take my child first? And the automatic answer is find an academy. So we have a ladder. We have academy, which is hopefully associated with the Junior Darts Corporation. The JDC have multiple systems in order for children to progress. And notice how I'm not saying boys and girls here. It's both of them. They can do whatever they want. And then when you find success with the JDC system, things like Super 16 or JDC World Championship, or indeed the World Cup trip to Gibraltar every year, you can then move forward to development tour stuff. So there's a progressionary system which everybody needs.
So let's climb back down that ladder then a little bit now and talk about academies, because it's had a massive influx, courtesy of the Luke Littler effect, what he did at Alexandra Palace a couple of years ago. There's something in place now where it doesn't matter about your ability, does it? If you fancy having a go, you can have a go. You can start in an academy. The JDC got a fantastic system, haven't they? It's a bit like the judo belt system where you start off with a certain colour belt, and the more you progress, you'll move up the ladder. There's very much something for everyone, isn't it, when it comes to those sorts of setups?
I think what the JDC understood is that nobody was doing this as an umbrella company. So if an academy was struggling to give their kids progression, they've got something in a uniform sense, which, I mean, everybody wants to get better at what they do. But without the JDC system for shirts and the green zone board and things like that, what did these academies do? A lot of them were shooting in the dark. They were just giving them things to do, and they didn't really have anywhere to take them after that. At least with this system, they're able to do that. Now, I've firsthand visited certain academies. I remember going to Stockport Academy, which was run by a great guy up there, and he was using his own time at a college to try and give young kids a chance to get better. Fabulous. This was nearly 15 years ago. So he was doing it well before it was fashionable. I went to East Kent Darts Academy a couple of times because I had a young kid that I was coaching who was part of that academy. I remember walking into that, speaking to the guy that was running it and thinking, what a great job he's done to look after these kids and give them tournaments and challenges. And all the parents there were so passionate about giving their kids the opportunity. These unsung heroes need a great deal of credit for what they've done. But when they get affiliated as well, they can send their kids onto certain tours with the JDC. So if they want to progress, they can.
And it's a little bit like, I suppose, with the FA coaching courses, where you can now have a JDC verified coach, a little bit like an FA qualified coach to coach a kids football team. And then you get FA funding in football, and there's now JDC funding in darts. So what is happening, particularly with the JDC, is there's an alignment with a program which is in line with other major sports in this country.
Yeah, I remember during COVID speaking to Darren Barson at the JDC, and he said, we want to put this qualification into play, along with Chichester College. There was a guy there who had an idea about giving someone who was willing to do a coaching course to become an affiliated, accredited darts coach. Now, 15 years ago, I went to Germany to a bar in Rodgau called House of Darts. And they asked me, can you do a coaching deal with a lot of our members? And I said, I'd love to do this. I was there all Saturday long, teaching people how to do stuff and to get the fundamentals right. And that's where I thought darts coaching, it really could be something. But until I'd actually done the qualification, I was the first to pass it with some other people as well, we were seen as mavericks in a bad way, because people would say to our face, darts coaching isn't a thing. And I'd say to them, well, how can you coach golf, but you can't coach darts then? And they start thinking differently, because it's about the image of the sport. Prior to darts coaches having affiliated and accredited certificates and qualifications, the coaching you would get would be at the end of the bar. You'd ask the most experienced person on your team, well, how do I do this? And they'd try and give you coaching, most of the time it'd be wrong. But nowadays, you can get in touch with someone who knows what they're doing and they're accredited.
And since what Luke Littler did, and I know that that's led to a real boom. I mean, to the point where you put on the BBC News at 1 on the day of the World Final, and they go to an academy in St Helens, they go to another academy elsewhere in the country. There's no lie in the fact that what he's done has led to a real influx of young people taking up the sport, and young people actually seeing playing darts as a potential professional career option, where maybe, again, even 10 years ago, that might have been something. If you said to your teacher, Miss, I want to be a dart player on Mulder, probably would have been laughed at a little bit.
Well, let me tell you a story, because you're absolutely right about Littler, and the effect that he's had on academies has been profound. So there are waiting lists for certain academies around the country, which is a good thing, because it means that maybe another academy in that area can be opened, and it opens up more stories and potential for the future. But when I was at school, I was 16 years of age, sitting at the front of a class, and my PE teacher, Mrs. Brown, who was a local magistrate, she was hard-nosed, she was tough. She asked everybody in that class, because we were talking about different sports, she asked everyone, has anyone hit a 147 on a snooker table in this class? And nobody put their hand up. She said, okay, has anybody ever hit 180 on a dartboard? I'm at the front of the class, I put my hand up, and everybody around me knows that I'm good at darts. And she said, how many 180s have you hit, Paul? And I said, I'm sorry, miss, I don't count anymore, because I've been hitting them for years. And she asked me to stand up, walk out. She said, I don't like liars in my classroom. 2 years later, when I made my county debut, I took that article from the local paper and I showed her and I said, don't call me a liar. Thing is, perception's different now. If a kid puts their hand up in the class and says, I'm good at darts, what people should say is, go to your local academy and get better then.
And I suppose there's also a pressure possibly from parents as well. And how much of a role do they play, particularly in terms of development? Because what you don't want is perhaps there being a perception that there would be with professional footballers, where you get signed up to an academy, you're good, and then there can be a perception that my son's going to be or daughter's going to be a professional footballer, where in darts that could possibly be a problem that arises in the next few years.
Yeah, we've started to see it with some parents, and they are quite pushy. So it's a responsibility of the parent to understand that you allow the child to enjoy the sport for as long as possible. And when they get to a certain stage where they're not thriving and they still want to play, that's when you give them other opportunities. There is such a thing as starting too early and putting too much pressure on a kid. Do not allow them at 8, 9, 10 years of age, even younger than that. Let's take you to an academy at the age of 5 or 6. No, let them grow. The thing is, when they're about 11, 12 or 13, they're starting to get to a height where they can throw at a regulation height dartboard. Before that, it's about using the dartboard effectively at the height that will be good for them, and then using progressionary tactics to make sure that they don't stop enjoying it.
As a professional coach, what would be your advice to a parent with a son or daughter that's absolutely fixated by the sport and maybe wants to take it a little bit further?
Depending on the age, get the right advice locally. There are some great local coaches. They're all affiliated with the JDC, the good ones. And the thing is, keep it safe, keep it fun, and make sure that you don't put too much pressure on them to be like Littler too soon. He is the exception to the rule. We don't get Luke Littlers every year. We get one maybe in the words of Michael van Gerwen, every 17 years. So if your kid enjoys playing darts, give them all the tools to enjoy it, because it's good for their brain. It's good to get them away from devices, and it's good to understand competitiveness about winning and losing. So use it to its full degree, but be smart.
Nico, thank you. Thank you for watching the latest edition of the Tungsten Talk here at the MODUS Super Series.